This is the Amy Edwards Show, and I'm your host, Amy. This show is here to help all of us live our best life and feel amazing at absolutely every age. We focus on transformation and empowerment through practical tools, strategies, habits, and mindset shifts that will help you unlock your potential, build self-love, and embrace your unique journey. We'll cover everything from health and wellness to personal growth and spirituality with inspiring guests and real conversations. So if you are ready to level up, break out of your comfort zone, and make lasting changes, you're in the right place. It's never too late. In fact, some of your best days haven't even happened yet. Let's get to it. Love this moment and make the next one even shinier. Hello, and welcome to the show. I am so excited you're here. I have been on a microbiome gut journey myself, and we are talking further about that today with a citizen scientist, as she is called. So I'm so excited to welcome to the show Martha Carlin. Martha is the founder of the BioCollective. It's a company that transforms whole stool samples into microbial metadata, and they're developing the United States' first national microbiome reference material. And then she also has a company called BiotiQuest. And she is all about understanding and repairing the human microbiome, which I'm just it's second brain, it's gut health, and it's so important. So I'm so excited to talk to her. And we're going to hear about her story and her husband, John, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2002 at the age of 44, and also suffered from long COVID, and unfortunately passed away from a long battle on the 26th of September, just a couple of months ago. And Martha, I'm just so happy to welcome you to the show. I know your life mission changed dramatically with your husband's diagnosis, and now you just went from business consultant and systems thinker and turnaround expert to this mission in your life to help other people find their own, best health, I suppose, right? You say balance your gut, change your health story. And I just want to welcome you to the show and offer my condolences too on the passing of your husband. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you for that wonderful intro.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. You're welcome. And how are you? How are you doing right now? I think I'll just ask you that.
I am doing okay. When you live with somebody who has a chronic illness, you're going through a grieving process kind of the whole way, each of you in your own way, because as things change, you lose different aspects. And so you sort of deal with a lot of that along the way. But like for me, John and his illness was a major catalyst for really changing my life and giving me a tremendous purpose that I didn't have before. And so I still have that purpose. I still feel John with me. And so even though I'm sad and I miss him, I still feel him very strongly with me in my purpose and my mission. And he was so integral in really teaching us, and some of the scientists I'm working with on some research papers now, teaching us so many things that, people aren't aware of. So,
wow. Yeah. I mean, like when you're going through grief, but you can find purpose, it can make all the difference no matter what you're going through, right? If you can capture that purpose. And has it shifted what you're learning with the BioCollective and BiotiQuest?
So it really so just a little background on what happened with John. So John's Parkinson's journey, he really had remarkably good outcome with his Parkinson's. I'd say probably was in the top 1 or 2% in terms of how the Parkinson's had affected him. He was very involved in exercise programs, which really helped him. I developed our primary probiotic for him, which he had some great results from that. The gut is very much associated with Parkinson's. We had found a parasite through the work we were doing with the BioCollective and looking at microbiome samples, and that treatment had really helped him with cognition and his memory. And but he had a very severe case of COVID at the end of 2021 and had a lot of long COVID symptoms. And so I started to look at and talk to more people who were really digging deeper into long COVID and also outcomes in the people who had poor outcomes in with COVID or had more long COVID symptoms and the connection to the gut. And this is actually maybe not that well known, but the people who had not as good outcome when they got COVID are people who had low bifidobacteria in their gut. And that's also a connection with Parkinson's. And the bifidobacteria are something we're also losing in our babies. So those are the first microbes that our babies are colonized with, especially when we're breastfeeding. So we have this kind of major ecological shift going on, I would say. But then I really began to dig in and try to understand better, what was going on with some of these long COVID symptoms, because he had something called POTS, or postural orthostatic hypotension, which is when you stand up, your blood pressure's dropping rapidly and you get dizziness. And so there were a whole suite of kind of new symptoms that I started trying to understand. And about a year into that, I met a researcher from Australia who started working with me and trying to help me understand how all these pieces fit together in what's going on with the gut and John's gut in particular, and how it's connected to body temperature and salt concentration. We're made out of the ocean. There were just a lot of pieces of the puzzle that I guess added a whole nother layer on to my understanding of what's going on in the body, because, the initial focus was just, okay, which bacteria are in your gut? What could they be doing? What can they be producing? And now it's sort of adding these different layers to how those bacteria are interacting in your system and what this internal battle could be doing overall. And so he ended up having a pulmonary embolism and a heart attack. And
what is a pulmonary embolism exactly?
It's basically a blood clot in the lungs.
Okay.
So, and I mean, he's been my teacher in so many ways. But about 2 weeks after he passed, I'm always trying to deconstruct. I'm a systems thinker. I'm looking for answers, and I was thinking about that. And Dr. Ninham, the researcher in Australia that I was talking to, we had on a number of occasions talked about changes in like solar radiation or electromagnetics having an impact on my husband, and we talked about temperature, which I mentioned. Well, we talked about pressure, so air pressure. And the day that John had his pulmonary embolism was the day before Hurricane Helene made landfall, which was one of the largest drops in barometric pressure on record. And if you know anything about the bends and scuba diving, that's, one of the things that can happen there is, you can get these embolisms. And so I started thinking about I started thinking about that. And so I went back and I remembered my father had had a heart attack caused by a blood clot 19 years earlier, the day before Hurricane Katrina made landfall.
Oh my God.
So I went into the research and found, yes, these drops in barometric pressure actually increase the risk of pulmonary embolism.
It makes total sense. I mean, like, I see my dog when a storm is coming and she is freaking out and like panting and all this. And I'm like, something with the barometric pressure is going on in her body. I'm sure there's research on it or whatever, but why wouldn't it affect us in ways? Maybe we're just larger animals, so we're not feeling it as much, but it makes sense. And it's just so wild to think there's all these other factors at play affecting us all the time.
Yeah, and I think some of it is too, we have so many sensory things going on now. We've lost some of our environmental sensitivity to things. We just don't notice.
Of course, we have so many other things going on. Yeah, and it could be a number of different things too, right? All the time, because like just the things that we're going to talk about today, like, what you're eating, the soil, the just a whole host of things, right? Hormones, I mean, it could be a number of things. So it starts to sound complicated. So how do we, back up a little bit and uncomplicate it for ourselves when we're starting to really delve into our own microbiome and getting as healthy as possible?
Well, one of the first things, you know, people want to a lot of times dig into all of the details and, try to study and figure out, okay, what's in there. I like to sort of back it up and try to understand what and how people are eating first, because I think people are becoming more aware of what's happened in our food supply in the last 50 to 100 years. But, we are really, from an evolutionary perspective, we're coming in contact with so many chemicals and processed things that, 50 or 100 years ago, our body wasn't having to deal with. And that's, these microbes. We are actually more microbial than we are human. So I think the number of cells is about 2 to 1 microbial to human, but the number of functions that are performed, like genes in the microbiome, is about 300 times what the human genome is. So that is really our primary factory that's making all these vitamins, hormones, neurotransmitters. And so the raw materials that it has to work with is the food and the, water or liquids or whatever that we're putting through this pipe.
So that makes total sense. That makes total sense. And then I think, you back that up and we're talking about soil health and where this food is coming from. Did you see that video that went viral of grass-fed beef and the cows are all just in pens and they're driving a truck down the middle just shooting grass this grass looks dyed green. It does not look right. And it's like they're just shooting grass at these things, at these animals. And it's just sobering. You're like, you can't even trust, what you're reading. And so.
Well, there are a lot of loopholes in the regulation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Right. Right.
Because like I think about, there's so many grass-fed supplements now.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just kind of think about the volume of supplements there are, and you're intuitively knowing how many grass-fed cows there are end to end, it's not really possible that they're all 100% grass-fed. And so that label actually, they can be grass-fed up to a certain point and they can be finished a different way and still called grass-fed. So, there's a lot of little things about the food supply that, if you go looking, you can educate yourself deeper and deeper. But I also, I don't want people to get so obsessed, with every little thing that they feel like they can't eat or they won't eat, or, we can get overly emotionally caught up in what that food is. And that has a huge effect. I mean, the biology,
Toxic. Yes.
the biology of belief and the mind is so powerful. I mean, I think just having the right mindset when you're eating, that you are not eating on the run, that you are sitting in a quiet, peaceful situation. You are grateful for the food that you have. You are, asking that the food nourish your body, and that if there's anything in there that's not nourishing, that you're telling your body and giving it instructions to get rid of anything I mean, our body has incredible amount of intelligence. Um, but there are also, sort of backing it up again, there's a lot of chemicals and things used in the food supply. So I like to start with just talking to people about eating whole foods, whole, real foods that aren't processed. And do they know how to cook? Or, if they don't know how to cook, sharing with them a simple recipe or a simple way. You don't have to be a fancy cook to be able to cook and eat whole foods. And really, if you learn how to cook a little bit, it's more cost effective than eating out in restaurants, which often have a lot of the processed ingredients in them, or eating prepackaged foods. And kind of one of the tips I like to give people where they think they're going to the healthy section of the grocery store, and whether you have, bags of pre-cut vegetables, or you have a tub of hummus or something like that. All of those things that are prepackaged like that, they have to put some kind of preservative in the package so that it doesn't rot. Well, or break down on the shelf so that it has some shelf life. Well, a lot of those things are anti-enzymatic. And of course, the enzymes are what digests and breaks down our food. So if you're eating food that has anti-enzymatic preservatives on it, that's going to affect your ability to break down the food. So, it might take you 5 more minutes to chop up your own carrots, but chop up your own carrots.
Yeah. And how is this for you? How has this been for you? Because I'm guessing this was all developed in the last 22 years for you personally. Like, you probably didn't have that mindset around food before, or did you?
No, I mean, I learned how to cook from my mother. She was a fabulous cook, but I didn't have that mindset about food. So, you mentioned my background was as sort of a business systems. I was trained in this process called transaction flow review, and had used that to draw flow charts of everything that's going through a business and look for business risk. Well, when John got diagnosed with Parkinson's, I was like, this is a systems problem. And so I was like, okay, I got to start with what's flowing through the system. And so I went first to food, because that is the main thing flowing through our system. And I threw out everything in the cabinet and started to try to figure out, 23 years ago, there was not a lot of organic food. So then I started researching and studying, okay, how are we growing this food? What chemicals are we using on it? What are the herbicides and pesticides? How can they impact somebody with Parkinson's? Because, one of the things I had thought about was, John was a marathon runner and very athletic, but he, athletes, they have those like fructose, glucose, goo things that they would.
So gross. Those are so gross. Yes.
They're
Yes.
so gross, but they would give them in there.
Sure.
And so he had those, and he was drinking this soy protein shake every day. So those were 2 places that I first went, was like looking at like what's in these goos and what's in these soy protein shakes. And that's what really led me to looking at, I hadn't paid any attention to genetically engineered food or glyphosate or any of the organophosphates or different chemicals that were used on food. And I was like, geez, nobody should be eating any of this. And so I tossed everything out and really tried to go all organic and cooking and stuff, but I was still a pretty busy executive. And, John was out doing his cycling and running and different stuff. And so you're eating out in restaurants and you don't think about like what's in the restaurants. And there's been so much progress in the last 23 years of understanding, what we've done to the food. And John used to jokingly say, "Oh yeah, Martha's got me on no fun diet number 22. She learned something new." But diet really has a tremendous impact on your microbiome. And again, if that's your kind of central factory for making all those hormones, neurotransmitters, and everything, it's really important to understand what's in the food you're eating
Mhm.
and how that can potentially, the gut, the brain, it's all connected. Everything's connected. That soil that we're putting chemicals on, I did a talk once about, we think about these things that we're doing out there. They're not really out there. They're in here. We're doing them out there, but they make their way in here through what we eat. So, we have to be more mindful and thoughtful about what we're doing because
And I mean, honestly, somebody could have been buried in that very soil, however long, 110,000 years ago, who knows, And so we don't know, like, it all comes back around. I mean, it is all connected. And it's all connected in our bodies too, the connection between gut and brain health. You mentioned neurotransmitters as well. And you were a really early adapter, Martha, like really early on this trend, because I feel like now it's part of the conversation.
it is. But so I started the company in 2015 and people were like, "What? What are you talking about?"
Mhm.
But it's so funny. I went to a conference in London in 2016 and, um, it was I was there by myself. I went out to dinner and I had all these kind of interesting things happen along the way. But I was on my way back to the hotel by myself, and I'm walking along. I'm using my GPS, and I've turned down this very dark street. There were no street lights, and my phone battery is about to run out. And I look up, and there's this big marquee, and it has this lit up. It says everything is connected. And I was like, "Okay, yes, I get it." But, I was talking to people about everything being connected back then and how important the gut was, and it was just in its infancy, really. So it's great to really see how much it's progressed and how people are really starting to get it. But I would also say part of the reason why people are getting it is because so many people have gut problems.
Oh my gosh, yes. So as you've developed this, what kind of results are you seeing in other people or in yourself? Or John?
So the first formula that I made was one we called Sugar Shift, and the idea for that actually came. I went to a Parkinson's conference with John in Portland, and there were some researchers there who showed in their studies that the sugar alcohol mannitol could actually stop the aggregation of the proteins that are kind of a hallmark of Parkinson's. And in this animal mouse model, they could actually pull them out of the brain and remove them. And I was, wow,
That is wild. Yeah.
wow, that's exactly. So I came and I bought this little mannitol chemistry book and started.
Oh my God, I love you. You're like, "So I got a mannitol chemistry book." I'm like, "What?" Yeah, you are like the poster child for do your own research. You're like, "Okay, I will." Wow. Wow. Okay.
So,
Sorry.
uh,
Please
uh,
continue.
anyway, I dug into that little book and I was like, wow, this is an amazing molecule. It's on the World Health Organization list of essential medicines. It's used in brain trauma to reduce brain swelling. It's used to help in drug delivery to get things across the blood-brain barrier, all these different things. But there was a chapter in there about different bacteria that can produce mannitol through fermentation. And I had a friend who was a fermentation chemist, and I went to him and I was like,
You did. Okay, great. Yes, of course you did.
can we, can we make a formula, like a little team of microbes that could actually make the mannitol in your gut, like put back this function? And he said, yeah, I think we can. So we came up with this 8-strain formula and just made a little prototype of it for John. And at the time, John was, I'll say, he had a few up and down periods, and that was definitely one of his down periods. And he was walking with a cane and having trouble navigating crowds. Like he couldn't really, swim through a crowd of people.
Yeah.
And so we made the product and gave it to him, and we're measuring his microbiome. And by that, I mean collecting poop. I'm the poop queen, kind of. And within a month, he was not walking with a cane anymore. And, we were measuring those microbiome measurements, and we could see in the data that it was moving back closer and closer to the profile of the healthy human microbiome from the Human Microbiome Project research. And we were like, okay, wow, this is really something. So then we just sort of gave it out to different people to try, and people were like, oh, like this helped fix my constipation, or, I have better energy, or I'm sleeping better. So we actually didn't really bring it so that was 2017. We didn't bring it to the market as a product really until 2022, because we were still very much focused on building our microbiome sample bank of poop, basically. And that's another area where we learned something about Parkinson's that, all these years later came into play with this Australian scientist. So we would collect the whole stool. So we developed this kit that was a box that had this little hammock that sat on your toilet. And all you had to do was pick the hammock up and drop it in the box. So you never had to touch it or anything.
Very nice. Very nice.
Like it was ick-free. And we built this bank out. But every time somebody with Parkinson's would send in a sample, finally the team came to me and they said, you know what? We can tell if somebody has Parkinson's just from their stool sample.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, like what is it? And they said, well, it's kind of like concrete. And,
they could just tell without putting it under a microscope by the texture and consistency or something?
Yes.
Wow.
And
that's weird.
severe constipation can precede a diagnosis of Parkinson's by 10 or 15 years. And I think often doctors don't really understand the severity of a constipation, because the more I learned about this, the more I've talked to people with Parkinson's or their spouses. And, I think part of the problem with the constipation is it makes a very dense colloidal mass that is painful to pass. So then your body, is tightening up and not wanting to pass it. But we processed all of our samples for our bank by basically homogenizing them and putting them into a syringe that then we would fill these little tubes and they would go into the freezer. But with Parkinson's, we couldn't use the syringe because of the concrete type texture of the stool. They actually had to use a caulking gun. But there was nothing at all in the literature about this. So fast forward, to last year when I met Dr. Nenham in Australia. He's a physical chemist. His expertise, he has very broad expertise. He's in his 80s, but one of his areas of expertise is colloidal chemistry. And when I started describing this to him and we started talking about, what John was experiencing metabolically, like you could see the metabolic swings in him from a sort of acidic to an alkalized, sort of back and forth. What Dr. Nenham figured out is this battle between the good and bad bacteria in the gut. The bad bacteria were producing an enzyme called urease, and that would kill the good bacteria that would spill their calcium and potassium, and that makes like a concrete colloidal mass. So then you can't access the nutrients, so you're nutrient deprived, and it makes it very difficult for you to pass. And he suggested to us actually that we try, because those bacteria wouldn't make that enzyme if we lowered the body temperature. And so we started using an ice pack when he would eat. And then he stopped having these problems. He stopped waking up in the middle of the night.
It was used an ice pack where? Like on his stomach.
Wow. Lowered the body temperature in that particular area, maybe a half a degree or a degree, maybe. It was really remarkable. And, something so small and subtle could make that kind of difference.
Wow. And overall, I just want to address the massive shift that this is about thinking about Parkinson's, because we've always heard it's a brain or neurological disease, correct? And to shift into looking at the gut is just a leap, but we're making these leaps about all these things, right?
Yes. Well, I ended up founding the company because, so I read a book in 2015 by Dr. Martin Blaser called Missing Microbes. And he was talking about the rise of chronic disease instead of acute problems in this age of antibiotics that we've all grown up in. And he didn't talk about Parkinson's, but he talked about diabetes and a number of other chronic diseases. And I did know this sort of connection with people with Parkinson's, many of them either having blood sugar issues or some of them having a comorbidity of diabetes. But about 6 months later, Dr. Philip Schepperhans from Finland published the first paper, and he showed, so Parkinson's has two primary types. One is where the tremor, which is what most people are familiar with. The other is called posture and gait, and that's where people are sort of stooped over and their feet freeze. They have trouble walking. Mm. And Dr. Schepperhans could tell the difference in those two groups of people by the bacteria in their gut. He could distinguish them. And I was like, wow, that's it. Goal. And
yeah,
I quit my job and started funding research at the University of Chicago. And that was basically the spark for founding the BioCollective, because the researcher at the University of Chicago, Dr. Jack Gilbert, had a child with autism. And there's overlap in the gut profiles of autism and Parkinson's. And then our third co-founder, Dr. Suzanne Vernon, had studied chronic fatigue for about 20 years, and there were some overlaps there. And so we started thinking, okay, we call these things individual diseases. We look very reductionist at so many things, but really, if you kind of go below the surface, there are interconnected metabolic problems in our guts that manifest in different ways. And so that's where the idea for the BioCollective came, is like, let's collect a bank of samples from the population across different profiles and see if we can find those connections. And then from that, see if we can start to develop ways to restore the gut. And so that's how the sugar shift idea came first. And then we used basically computational modeling, machine learning, or what people would probably call AI now. The big complex data sets and predicting the interaction of a team of microbes to produce a certain outcome. So that conversion of glucose and fructose into mannitol that we wanted, or we have a cardiovascular formula that produces CoQ10 and nitric oxide. And so we have a sleep product, and that's focused on bacterial melatonin and tryptophan. And so we started to look at, okay, how can we fix things down at this baser level in the gut using kind of teams of microbes?
That is fascinating. And what about like dementia and Alzheimer's? Have you also had some people interact with you that are studying that?
So there's a researcher over in Japan who's done a lot of work in Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. There are some connections there also to the gut bacteria and also to oral bacteria. So they've found that Porphyromonas gingivalis, which is often found if you have gum disease, they find those microbes in the brains of people with Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's.
And the bifidobacteria that I was talking about before, that we're losing, is also, they actually have a product over in Japan that they have studied, a strain of bifidobacteria that has improved mild cognitive impairment. So I think it's still sort of early days in figuring out how to address that, because what I've learned from looking at people with Parkinson's and their microbiome and the Alzheimer's samples that I've looked at, it can be complex, this sort of metabolic problems that are going on. And again, you got to sort of back up and address the toxins that you're coming in contact with, what your diet is, what your lifestyle is. And there's is it Dr. Bredesen? He has a book called Ending Alzheimer's, or The End of Alzheimer's. He has a pretty complex protocol, but he's addressing all of those different things, and each person individually kind of has a different layout or profile of the things they've been exposed to. And that's also been, part of my journey with John and with other people with Parkinson's, is really getting their story. Like, what's your story? Where did you come from? Like, how did you grow up? What were the stressors in your life? And I had this idea of building, a little app on your phone that you could kind of put all these different things in, of illnesses that you've had, stressors that you've had, the way you ate, or, were you a big party animal in college and, drinking and partying all the time, and medications that you've taken. Or I had like 6 or 7 different kind of key areas of stress. Did you own a business or lose a business or get divorced or, have a debt, all these stressors, and like draw this little map of your life on one page. Because I think the other thing is, people, cause and effect aren't always closely related in time. And so people can't always see that connection back to, oh, yeah, so my husband, John, grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 60s and 70s. And that's when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. There was a lot of chemical pollution. He also worked on a golf course, during the summers. So he was around a lot more herbicides and pesticides. And, if you start to sort of lay out this picture and put it together, you can start to see the patterns. And I would, I would talk to people with Parkinson's. Oh, I grew up on a farm. Lots of people grew up on a farm, and they remember the crop dusters flying over when they were kids, or playing in the puddles with the filmy, the chemicals in the puddles. And you can start to connect dots that doctors don't really have time to connect or look at. So I've started doing a lot of that over the years. And how do those things impact the microbiome? Because again, the microbiome is you're selecting a terrain by the things that you're exposed to. And then the microbes that are there are dealing with the things that are in the terrain. If that's, food or chemicals that are in the food or things that are, that you're environmentally exposed to.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, it's interesting that you have to go back that far, because I was going to say, how long were you and John together before he was diagnosed?
So,
because if you're with someone and you're leading a similar lifestyle, that's the part where you go, okay, fine. I guess we've got to, of course, people are making their own choices. My fiance and I eat very differently, but you're exposed to sort of the same things perhaps. And so it's interesting that you got to look at this bigger picture.
Well, and, some people are just more sensitive or can't or can't. But actually, so John and I got married in 1995, but we refound each other. So we actually met in college and dated for about, I'll say probably like 3 months. And I never heard from him again. I didn't know what happened to him. And he got shingles, actually, which is very rare for somebody in their 20s. He had shingles on his face from the stress of that final semester and trying to graduate and all of that. And didn't see him again, married somebody else. And I ran into him 13 years later in a completely different state in Texas in a bar.
Oh.
And that night, I went home after talking to him almost all night. Like the next morning, I called my girlfriend and I said, okay, you're going to think I'm crazy. I said, I'm going to marry him.
Wow.
So,
yeah,
I think it was
really sweet.
Definitely meant to be. But yeah, so we had been together from 1995 and he was diagnosed in 2002. So 7 years.
This podcast is sponsored by Wands. Wands creates luxurious pleasure practice tools that help people become more connected to their bodies. They have a huge selection of incredible items like yoni eggs, the most gorgeous crystal pleasure wands you've ever seen, free bleed blankets, and my favorites, the trademarked glass cervix wand and the Venus wand, which is their heaviest wand made of stainless steel, and their new ecstatic vibrator. This company is woman-owned and creates products designed to help you become more connected to your body and your pleasure and support the healing of pelvic pain. Get yours today in their always discreet packaging at wands.com. That's Wands with 2 A's, WAANDS.com, and use my link in the show notes to get 10% off or enter the code Amy Edwards at checkout. Again, that's Wands, WAANDS.com. The Amy Edwards Show is sponsored in part by Higher Dose. Higher Dose creates wellness tech for everyone with tools, supplements, and body care. And I have 15% off for you with my code MAGIC15. Higher Dose has been featured in Goop, Glamour, Elle, Vogue, Bazaar, Allure, and more. I have their infrared pulsed electromagnetic field, or PEMF mat, which emits electromagnetic waves that mimic natural frequencies found in nature, stimulating and encouraging your body's natural recovery process. It also has 20 pounds of crystals in it and has shown to ease chronic pain, aid in exercise recovery and circulation, deepen your meditations, reduce stress, and improve total body relaxation. I also love their red light face mask. It stimulates collagen, reduces fine lines, regenerates cells, and it's soft and easy to use and store and even travel with. I'm a true fan of these items and more, like their glow serum. So I'm excited to offer you 15% off using my code MAGIC15. Go to the show notes. You can click through on the link right there. Or if you go to Higher Dose, just enter the code MAGIC15 for 15% off. HigherDose.com. This podcast is sponsored by The Collective ATX. If you're looking for the best in hair extensions, it's The Collective ATX. They do mine, and I won't go anywhere else. I've tried them all over the years, and finally, I've found what makes my real hair stronger and fuller, and even works with my natural curl. They keep all their extensions in-house, so there's no wait, and they specialize in no damage to your natural hair like traditional hair extension methods. Plus, they're pros at color and covering gray. I have literally never in my life been happier with my color. They were named a top 200 salon by Salon Today in 2023. They've changed my hair journey. Let them change yours. The Collective ATX link is in the show notes.
I heard many years ago something about, I'll bring up too, that you were reading Michael J. Fox's book when you started to notice symptoms in your husband, which I thought was really a wild coincidence. And I heard something many years ago that he had worked on a TV show in Canada that several people that had worked on that show were diagnosed with Parkinson's. Did you ever hear that?
I did not hear that, but that is really, really interesting.
I don't know where I heard that or if it's true or not. I did watch the show that he recently put out, and it was very interesting too. Have you had any connection with your company through him or with him or anything?
I have not had connection directly with him, but you know what's interesting about that? There's a researcher that I know pretty well out in California that studies Parkinson's, and he's had a number of spousal pairs where both spouses have gotten Parkinson's.
Really? Wow.
I have talked to a few couples where they both have Parkinson's. And if you think about it, you know, the microbes, well, the environmental factors, and then the microbes, you share the microbes with the people in your house. So, and I have data and some hypothesis about, which microbes might be involved, that we're working on, but you could pass those back and forth.
I would think, if I'm kissing someone or,
But we have different immune systems. And so
right.
That has to do with your immune system and whether or not it's able to deal with something. But, that's really interesting with a show like that.
I don't know. I'll have to look it up, but yeah, it was interesting. How resilient is our microbiome? Does it want to go back to health and have the tendency or ability to bounce back quickly, or
they have done research, exposure to antibiotics and how quickly it bounces back. And there's some ecological theory, I can't think of the name of it now, but basically you have a disruption and it sort of returns back to equilibrium, but maybe not 100%. And then you have another disruption. And each time you're having this disruption, it's getting a little bit harder to get back to that stability. But the research, and some of the top researchers are Dr. Rob Knight and Jack Gilbert, who was my co-founder, have done a lot of this population level research kind of showing that we have a core microbiome, and that core is often established by the time we're, say, 3 or 4 years old.
Not wild? Wow.
And so those first early years are really important. And then it's resilient for the most part. But that's one of the things that some of the Parkinson's research has shown is it's not very resilient. There's all kinds of variability. It's not resilient and going back to kind of a strong and stable core.
Wow. One of my friends who is an Eastern medicine doctor mentioned to me the other day about fecal transplants. Have you heard much about this? And then she said they're doing it in Mexico. And I was like, it's kind of gross. But
yes, actually. Oh, yeah. I know a lot about fecal transplants. And one of the earliest pioneers actually in the microbiome space was a company called BioCollective. And that was founded by a gastroenterologist. I don't know if he was affiliated with a hospital at Harvard, I think. And they still make fecal transplant material available. And that was originally focused on C. difficile infection. So
Yeah, there was one hair. There, you got it. You got it.
um,
Yeah.
which is, can be deadly. So, we had this huge rise in C. diff infections from people, and you get that from, one too many doses of antibiotics. And what happens
Yeah.
is that's the only organism left, and it sort of takes over and it produces a toxin, and it's really terrible. And fecal transplant turns out to be about, I want to say, between 94 and 97% effective at treating a C. diff infection. And so basically what you're doing is you're taking fecal matter from a healthy person and putting it into, the person who's got a C. diff infection. And so they've started now to look at it in a lot of other different therapy. They've looked at it in autism. They've done some research in Parkinson's. And there were 2 recent clinical trials, kind of interesting, because one is from Dr. Shepperhans, the one from Finland, who ended up becoming my friend. And they came from the bottom up. And it was not,
No pun intended.
yeah, was not successful.
Yeah.
And then there was a group I think in Belgium that came from the top down.
Oh, I see. I see.
Theirs was successful. And I think, for me, I think one of the key things there is, potentially this connection to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, which is where the microbes in the colon make their way up into the small bowel. And the small bowel is really, the small intestine is where we're supposed to be extracting those nutrients and getting them. But when you have migration of the fecal microbes up into the small bowel, it's competing with you for nutrients. And so I think by coming from the top down, they were able to potentially address and kick out the bad guys from the small bowel, and restore homeostasis, where coming from the bottom up, you're not getting into the small intestine. And so at least that's my hypothesis. I think that, they probably need to do quite a bit more research on that. And in the early stages of my company, there was also just a lot of, I'll say, freewheeling, crazy people who were like, I've got these gut problems. I'm going to try, making my own capsules, basically. And you would find biohackers who were asking people for their poop and not screening it. So, and then
swallowing it as a capsule?
Yeah.
Oh, my Lord.
So, if you go, you could go on a really wild roller coaster ride, kind of looking back over the last 9 years of, people doing their own fecal transplants and some crazy stuff. And I actually even had a customer who had sent us samples and done sequencing with us, who decided to get us fecal transplant from his dad and did all this stuff and made himself much worse. So, and they've also showed in both animal models and in people with C. diff who got transplants, like one woman got a transplant from an overweight child of hers, and she became overweight. Or so you can transplant skinniness and fatness, because the microbes are really in control of your whole metabolic health.
That is so wild. Yeah, and my friend actually mentioned too, she said, we were looking at a microbiome sample from someone that looked objectively healthy. It was like a guy that was working out and didn't drink and that kind of thing. But she was like, we were so surprised his gut microbiome wasn't very good. And I was like, I think that, you can look like you're doing all the right things, but it's not necessarily a marker that your gut microbiome is healthy.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
We often do look okay on the outside, but on the inside. And somebody asked me once, what is a healthy, or, because we're collecting samples from both healthy and, different diseases and stuff. And they asked me like, what do you think a healthy, or how many, people are healthy? And I said, honestly, like looking at these samples, I'm not sure a whole lot of the population is healthy. And that company, Open Biome, actually in their screening process of all the different things they do, they only accepted 3% of the people who applied because they pay people to give them samples.
Wow.
And only 3% of the people qualify for being healthy enough to be a stool donor.
Holy crap. No pun. Definitely there. Wow. How big is y'all's microbiome bank that you've got so far?
Well, so we don't do the bank anymore, and we actually we sold it. So
Oh, congratulations. That's
yeah,
good.
we stopped selling. I mean, sorry, we stopped collecting samples in 2020. No, 20. I guess yeah, it was 2020. So right when COVID broke out, we were finishing up this project where we made the reference material that Zymo Research sells, and that was from an NIH grant. And
Oh,
there was all this craze about COVID, and we were collecting, um, samples that are full of live microbes. And it was just starting to become apparent that there was, COVID in the gut, basically. And so we decided to shut that off and really move to the probiotics. But we had collected from about a little over 1,000 people and multiple samples from some of them. And then we did the genomic sequencing of all of those samples. So we had and we still have about 16 terabytes of data of, analytical data that we were looking at, kind of comparing across all of these populations. And we sold the bank to a company in California that is using it to build animal models to work on microbiome therapeutics, basically.
okay. Yeah, the animal part, I'm like just trying to make sense of that. I don't.
Well, they use these, they use mouse models. Men are not mice, but they use mouse models often, and they're used a lot in microbiome research. So they
Mhm.
humanize the mouse with the fecal matter, basically,
Wow.
and then study. Yeah, it's crazy.
Sounds very small. Sounds very small as well. I can only imagine the size of a
Yeah,
house's gut microbiome.
yeah, it's pretty crazy. Some of the
It's very wild what people are capable of doing. Well, so now your focus is on the probiotics.
yes.
Okay. What have we missed in discussing this? What have I missed in asking?
Well, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
I think what I really didn't talk about is, I didn't talk that much about the probiotics, but,
Okay, let's talk about the probiotics.
um, and maybe what I'd really just like to talk about is the one that I originally made for John, because we actually did do a clinical trial, a double-blind clinical trial with that product in people with diabetes. And, my people are pinging me with
They're beeping. They're like, you should be done with this podcast by
yeah.
now.
I'm like, "Stop." Uh, but one of the things I wanted them to measure in the clinical trial was something called serum endotoxin. And that's a marker, it's an inflammatory marker. It's used in animal models of diabetes, but it's also used in animal models of Parkinson's. So I wanted to see, is the probiotic reducing that serum endotoxin? And that was one of the markers that we had the best results from the product, was in lowering this endotoxin. Most people like, what's endotoxin? It's basically the cell wall of the bad guys, the gram-negative bacteria. Their cell wall components produce this really highly inflammatory endotoxin, and it's used in all of these different disease studies. So to me, if you're studying a disease and you're using endotoxin in your model to cause the disease, then to me it's highly inflammatory, yes, but reducing endotoxin is going to help you, be healthier across the board. So, that I would say was one of the big epiphanies from this. And we also worked very hard because of my interest in glyphosate and the exposure to that from the food supply in identifying and we have our own strain of Lactobacillus plantarum that is in every one of our formulas. And it actually breaks the glyphosate all the way down to phosphate, hydrogen, and water. And so
Wow.
you're detoxifying. And so in our clinical trial, looking at the microbiome, we had about a 900% increase in enzymes involved in detoxification in the gut. So it's enabling you to really better handle the things that we're coming into contact in our environment. And we are actually looking to do a little study. We have a product called antibiotic antidote that you take after you've had antibiotics. But my son had to take antibiotics, and he started taking the product, and he has one of those, I think it's called a Whoop or something. It's like a Oura ring that measures heart rate variability. And on the days when he was taking that antibiotic antidote, his recovery level was significantly higher than it was otherwise. And so we're going to do a little study recruiting people who either have an Oura ring or this Whoop to give them a bottle of this and see if they'll measure and give us their data so we can see, was that just a fluke with Charlie, or is that really something that this is potentially helping with heart rate variability? And then if so, we might look to do some clinical work around that.
That's amazing and interesting. Is there any downside to taking probiotics? Like, I feel like I need to go find probiotics right now and start taking them. So is there any downside, or can we take too many? Can you get in trouble from that? Or
Well, I think you can always overdo anything.
Well, yeah, probably.
No, you can always overdo anything. I did actually, I started digging into, so all of our products, we include prebiotics also to feed the bacteria, and we use chicory inulin. And I did some research for a pregnant woman this week, and I actually didn't know this, but I discovered that chicory inulin is something you don't want to take when you're pregnant because it can cause uterine contractions, which you obviously don't want to have while you're pregnant. So that was actually an interesting learning for me but all of our products do have chicory inulin in them.
I see. No, that's good to know. I mean, pregnant, you got to watch out for sure.
Yeah. You need to pay attention to everything you're doing when you're pregnant.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. All right. Now what did we miss? Or is there anything before we go that you really want to either reiterate or add?
I mean, I think we covered a lot.
We did. Well, I think we froze, unfortunately, with Martha, and I'm so sad because I know that she had a good wrap-up message about how everything she does came from John and her purpose and finding her purpose. And I was really moved by everything that drove her purpose and her love for her husband and her love for life and this body that we've got and how we can overcome diseases. So I just have to say a huge thank you to Martha. I guess we're not going to get her back. She might pop back in, but I just want to say a huge thank you to her and to you for being here today. This has been so eye-opening to me. And as we're wrapping up today, I have a meeting. If you missed my episode with Risa Grew, it was out about a month ago, and I will put a link to it here too. But we talked about the nutrition aspect of the gut microbiome. And so I am meeting with her today to do a consultation. So I am hoping to use some probiotics as well. I'm really curious to see how this continues to develop for me because I am on my own personal journey with it to better my own gut microbiome and see what happens. I'm always guinea pigging myself. So anyway, I'm so happy that you were here today. Thank you so much. Please feel free to share it with anyone, or maybe you know someone that has been diagnosed with Parkinson's. This is a super interesting research, and Big thanks to Martha. You can find her at, thebiocollective.com, or you can go to BiotiQuest, BiotiQuest. So all her stuff will be in the show notes as well. And I am just sending you also a whole lot of Thanksgiving love. So really thankful for her, thankful for you, thankful for this opportunity to keep amplifying things that are going to get us to, our next healthiest version, or perhaps just make us more aware and feeling better. And you never know how that's going to spill out into the world. And maybe you're just going to say something just off the cuff to somebody, then it's going to have that lasting impact, which is so wild, because I know some people have said things just randomly to me over the years, and they've really stuck with me, and I'm sure they probably don't have any clue, right? And so it's a wild thing. So thank you so much for being here. I just love you so much. I cherish this and value this so much. Follow more about the show with my newsletter. You can sign up at amyedwards.info or amyedwards.com, and it comes out every week and has links to podcasts that you might have missed. And I just want to express so much gratitude today, especially today, right? So keep staying grateful, and just keep moving forward, and eat whatever you want today. Have a good time. Don't worry too much about your gut microbiome today if you happen to be listening in real time. I love you so much. Till next time.
Thank you so much for being here. Please rate, review, and follow us. And we'd love to hear your feedback. Keep shining bright.